There are moments when life closes one door so completely that it feels like every dream has ended. Emily arrived in town hoping to learn from the region's most celebrated chef, only to be turned away without a chance to prove herself. But just days later, one humble bowl of homemade chicken and dumplings would bring an elderly mother back to the dinner table, rescue a struggling little restaurant, and change 3 lives forever. If stories of kindness, second chances, and the healing power of a warm meal speak to your heart, be sure to subscribe and join us for more inspiring journeys. A cool autumn breeze drifted through the narrow streets of Silver Ridge, Colorado, carrying the comforting scent of fresh bread and wood smoke beneath a sky washed pale by the fading afternoon sun. In the fall of 1892, Emily Carter stepped off the stagecoach with a single leather suitcase clutched in one hand and a worn recipe journal tucked carefully beneath her arm. At 25, Emily was slender yet remarkably strong from years of helping on her parents' small Kansas farm. Soft chestnut hair rested neatly beneath a simple bonnet, while gentle hazel eyes carried a quiet determination that hardship had never managed to extinguish. Her fair skin had been browned slightly by endless days beneath prairie sunlight, and although naturally shy with strangers, she possessed an uncommon patience and unwavering kindness. Since losing both parents to influenza 3 winters earlier, cooking had become more than a skill. Every recipe in her late mother's journal felt like a conversation that death had failed to silence. For months, Emily had dreamed of standing inside the famous kitchen of Benjamin Foster. The celebrated chef had built the finest restaurant in Silver Ridge, serving wealthy ranchers, railroad executives, and travelers willing to wait hours for a reservation. Benjamin was 50 years old, tall and impeccably dressed in a spotless white chef's coat, with neatly combed silver hair, a trimmed gray beard, and piercing blue eyes that noticed every mistake. His perfection had earned admiration throughout Colorado, but years of relentless success had quietly hardened him, leaving little room for beginners or second chances. Emily waited outside his kitchen door for nearly 2 days before finally receiving permission to enter. Benjamin glanced at her recommendation letter only briefly before returning it without expression. "Talent is not enough," he said calmly. "You have no professional training. My kitchen cannot become a classroom." His words were polite, yet they landed with the weight of a closing gate. Emily thanked him, folded the letter carefully, and walked back onto the street before allowing herself a slow, trembling breath. She refused to cry where anyone could see. As dusk settled over the town, she wandered toward the quieter end of Main Street, where a weathered little restaurant stood with only a single occupied table inside. Standing outside was Nathan Brooks, a 41-year-old cook whose broad shoulders and rough hands revealed years beside hot stoves rather than ranch fences. Thick dark hair framed a square, weathered face, softened by warm brown eyes and a short, well-kept beard. Once cheerful and outgoing, Nathan had become quieter after spending the past 2 years, caring for his widowed mother, Margaret, whose failing health had left both their home and restaurant struggling to survive. He had watched Emily leave Benjamin's restaurant with the unmistakable expression of someone carrying a broken dream. "You came here hoping to learn," Nathan said gently. "I can't offer fame, but if you're willing to work beside me, I can offer an honest kitchen." Emily looked through the restaurant window at the nearly empty dining room, then back at the man whose offer held neither pride nor pity. After a long silence, she smiled faintly and nodded. Sometimes the road that changes a life begins exactly where another one comes to an end. Emily's first morning at Brooks Family Restaurant began long before sunrise. The dining room was quiet enough that every creaking floorboard echoed through the building. Dust clung to forgotten shelves, the cast-iron stove was coated with old grease, and the faded menu hanging behind the counter looked unchanged for years. Only 3 tables had been prepared for customers because Nathan admitted there was rarely any reason to expect more. Emily walked slowly through the kitchen, touching every pan, knife, and wooden spoon as though introducing herself to an unfamiliar friend. She quickly realized the restaurant's greatest problem was not poor cooking. It was that nothing inside invited people to stay. Without being asked, she opened every window to let in the crisp mountain air, before scrubbing the counters, polishing the stove, and reorganizing shelves according to how a working kitchen should flow. Nathan watched quietly while repairing a loose cabinet hinge. He had spent so many years merely surviving that he had forgotten a restaurant could feel alive. He said nothing, but each small improvement loosened a burden he had carried since his father's death left the family business entirely on his shoulders. Late that morning, Emily carefully unwrapped her mother's weathered recipe journal. Its pages had softened from decades of use, stained with flour, butter, and tiny drops of broth collected over countless family meals. She paused at one familiar recipe before smiling to herself: chicken and dumplings. Her mother used to call it the meal that reminds people they're not alone. Emily decided that if the restaurant was ever going to survive, it had to begin with hope instead of profit. Nathan helped prepare the ingredients without asking unnecessary questions. They simmered a whole chicken slowly with onions, carrots, celery, garlic, thyme, bay leaves, and cracked black pepper until the broth became rich and golden. Emily mixed the dumpling dough by hand, folding flour, butter, milk, and baking powder together with practiced confidence before gently dropping soft spoonfuls into the steaming pot. The dumplings floated briefly before swelling into delicate pillows that absorbed every drop of flavor. Soon the entire building carried a warm fragrance unlike anything Nathan could remember smelling since childhood. He closed his eyes for only a moment. Memories returned unexpectedly. His late father laughing while chopping firewood outside, his mother humming quietly beside a stove. Even the sound of rain against the old restaurant windows seemed to echo somewhere inside the aroma filling the room. For the first time in years, Nathan realized he was no longer remembering loss first. He was remembering happiness. Emily filled a simple ceramic bowl and placed it carefully onto a tray beside fresh bread. "I'd like to bring this to your mother," she said softly. Nathan hesitated. "She hasn't eaten more than a few bites in almost 3 months. Most days she won't even answer when I knock. I'd still like to try." At the back of the building, Margaret Brooks rested in a modest bedroom overlooking a neglected herb garden. At 72, she had once been a lively woman known throughout Silver Ridge for welcoming strangers with fresh pies and warm conversation. Years of illness after losing her husband had left her painfully thin. Her silver hair, once carefully braided every morning, now rested loosely around a pale face marked by exhaustion. Yet beneath her fragile appearance remained gentle gray eyes that had not completely surrendered their quiet kindness. Emily placed the tray near the bedside without speaking. As she turned toward the door, the aroma reached Margaret before any words could. The elderly woman's fingers twitched against the blanket. Slowly she opened her eyes, inhaled deeply, and struggled to sit upright on her own. "What is that smell?" she whispered. Emily stepped closer. "Chicken and dumplings." Margaret stared toward the bowl as though seeing an old friend after many years apart. With surprising determination, she lowered her feet onto the floor. Her movements were slow and uncertain, but each step carried her closer to the doorway. Nathan stood frozen in the hallway, scarcely believing what he was witnessing. Margaret looked directly at Emily, her tired voice barely stronger than a breath. "Who made these chicken and dumplings?" "I did," Emily answered gently. Margaret accepted the bowl with trembling hands and tasted a single spoonful. She closed her eyes, and for several silent moments no one moved. Then she took another bite and another. Before either of them realized it, the bowl was empty. Nathan quietly wiped tears from his face as his mother smiled for the first time since his father had been buried. The first snowfall dusted the rooftops of Silver Ridge as the mornings turned colder, and warm light spilling from the windows of Brooks' family restaurant slowly became a welcome sight along the quiet street. Margaret Brooks recovered one careful step at a time. She was still frail, but each morning she insisted on dressing herself, carefully pinning back her silver hair before walking from her bedroom to the kitchen with the aid of a polished oak cane that had belonged to her late husband. She no longer ate because someone urged her to. She ate because she looked forward to sitting beside Emily, sipping tea while watching bread rise near the stove. As her strength returned, so did the stories she had nearly taken with her into silence. She spoke of the restaurant's earliest days, when she and her husband had served miners, ranch hands, and railroad workers from dawn until midnight. She laughed while describing little Nathan, who had once been a mischievous boy, forever sneaking warm biscuits from the cooling rack before customers could be served. Emily listened to every story while quietly taking notes inside the blank pages at the back of her mother's recipe journal. She realized recipes alone never built a memorable restaurant. Every dish carried the memory of the people who had first shared it. Within 2 weeks, familiar faces began appearing more often. A ranch hand who had stopped in only because another customer recommended the Chicken and Dumplings returned with 3 friends. A traveling salesman who had intended to eat once stayed long enough to order pie before leaving town. Every satisfied customer carried the same message beyond the restaurant walls. "It feels like eating at my mother's table." Nathan heard those words so often that they slowly replaced the fear that had lived inside him for years. Instead of counting unpaid bills each night, he found himself planning tomorrow's menu with Emily. They experimented carefully, adding fresh herbs from the neglected garden Margaret had once planted. Emily restored the tiny herb beds, nurturing thyme, sage, parsley, and rosemary until green shoots pushed through the cold soil again. Nathan repaired broken chairs, repainted faded window frames, and polished the old wooden counter until its rich grain reappeared beneath years of neglect. Their conversations gradually became easier. Nathan no longer spoke only about work. He asked Emily about Kansas, about her parents, and about the recipes she still remembered making as a little girl. Emily discovered that beneath Nathan's quiet reserve lived a thoughtful man with gentle humor. Years spent watching his family's restaurant decline and caring for his grieving mother had taught him patience, but they had also convinced him that happiness belonged to other people. Emily never argued with that belief. She simply continued bringing light into the kitchen each day until he slowly stopped believing it himself. One afternoon, a cheerful little girl wandered through the restaurant door carrying an empty soup pot nearly as large as her arms. Her name was Lucy Harper, an energetic 9-year-old with bright freckles, tangled red curls beneath a knitted cap, and curious green eyes that sparkled with fearless confidence. Lucy often delivered meals for her widowed aunt, who washed laundry for half the town. She happily announced that 3 different families had sent her to buy the same chicken and dumplings because everyone claimed it was the best thing cooked in Silver Ridge. Margaret laughed so hard she nearly spilled her tea. "Well," she smiled, "I'd say that's the finest advertisement we've never paid for." By the end of the week, nearly every table inside the little restaurant was occupied during the noon meal. The building no longer echoed with silence. Plates clinked together. Children laughed. Coffee cups were refilled before customers even needed to ask. Emily often glanced around the dining room in disbelief. Only a few weeks earlier, she had believed her dream had ended outside another kitchen. Now she was helping restore one that truly needed her. Across town, however, another kitchen remained unchanged. Benjamin Foster stood inside the spotless dining room of his famous restaurant, reviewing the evening reservations, when one of his regular suppliers casually mentioned that an unknown family restaurant had begun selling out of chicken and dumplings every afternoon. Benjamin paused only briefly before continuing his work, convinced that popularity built on a single comfort dish could never last. Still, as the supplier walked away, Benjamin found himself wondering why so many people had suddenly stopped talking about the finest restaurant in town and started talking about the smallest one. A crisp winter wind swept through Silver Ridge, carrying the smell of chimney smoke as people gathered along Main Street, all talking about the same little restaurant at the edge of town. Benjamin Foster disliked believing rumors, preferring to trust only what he could judge with his own eyes. For nearly 30 years he had built his reputation through discipline, flawless technique, and uncompromising standards. Yet every merchant, rancher, and traveler seemed to be repeating the same sentence. "You haven't truly eaten in Silver Ridge until you've tasted the chicken and dumplings at Brooks' family restaurant." The words lingered in his thoughts longer than he cared to admit. The following afternoon, Benjamin left his restaurant wearing an ordinary brown wool coat instead of his familiar white chef's jacket, Without announcing himself, he stepped quietly into Brooks' family restaurant and chose a small corner table where he could observe without being noticed. The room surprised him immediately. The tables were simple, the furniture showed its age, and nothing about the place suggested wealth. Yet every seat was occupied. Families lingered after finishing their meals instead of rushing home. Children laughed freely while older couples shared coffee beside the stove. The room felt less like a business than someone's welcoming home. Nathan greeted each customer by name, remembering favorite dishes without asking. Emily moved calmly through the dining room, her apron lightly dusted with flour, greeting strangers with the same gentle smile she offered regular guests. Benjamin noticed that neither of them hurried despite the busy lunch service. Every plate left the kitchen with the same quiet care. When Emily approached his table, she stopped for only a heartbeat after recognizing him. The memory of standing outside his kitchen with her folded recommendation letter flashed across her mind, but she refused to let old disappointment appear on her face. "What may I prepare for you today, sir?" she asked politely. Benjamin looked directly at her. "I'll have your chicken and dumplings." Emily simply nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. Benjamin watched through the open serving window as she prepared each bowl individually instead of scooping portions carelessly from the pot. She tasted the broth before serving, adjusted the seasoning with a pinch of fresh thyme, and gently placed 2 perfectly cooked dumplings on top before adding chopped parsley. There was no unnecessary decoration. Everything existed only to make the meal complete. When the bowl arrived, steam rose slowly into the winter air, carrying the comforting aroma of roasted chicken, butter, herbs, and fresh bread. Benjamin lifted the spoon with the practiced confidence of a man who had judged thousands of meals throughout his career. The first taste unsettled him. The broth was rich without being heavy. The dumplings were tender, yet held together perfectly. Every ingredient balanced naturally with the others. Technically, the dish was excellent, but that alone did not explain why the restaurant had become so beloved. As he continued eating, he understood what he had overlooked for years. The meal carried warmth that no recipe alone could teach. It reminded him of the first soup his own mother had cooked after he recovered from scarlet fever as a frightened boy. It reminded him why he had fallen in love with cooking before awards, wealthy customers, and endless expectations had slowly turned every meal into another performance. When he finished the final spoonful, Benjamin stood and walked into the kitchen. Nathan looked surprised, but welcomed him respectfully. Benjamin's eyes remained fixed on Emily. "I made a mistake," he admitted quietly. "When you came to my restaurant, I judged your experience instead of your heart." Emily remained silent. Benjamin continued, "Come work for me. I'll pay you 3 times what you're earning here. I'll teach you everything I know, and within a few years your name will be known across Colorado." The kitchen fell completely still. Emily looked toward Nathan, who lowered his eyes without speaking. He would never ask her to stay if a better future truly waited elsewhere. She stepped forward and smiled with genuine gratitude. "I'll always appreciate the offer, Chef Foster." Benjamin waited. "But I already found the kitchen where I belong." She glanced around the room, filled with familiar faces beyond the doorway. "You could have given me success. Nathan gave me a chance when I had nothing left to offer. Your restaurant needed another talented cook. This place needed hope." Benjamin slowly removed his hat. For the first time, in many years, he realized greatness could never be measured by reputation alone. A remarkable chef did more than create unforgettable food. A remarkable chef made every person who entered the room feel that they mattered. Without another word, he shook Nathan's hand, thanked Emily for the meal, and quietly walked back into the falling snow, with a different understanding of the profession he had devoted his entire life to. Spring arrived gently in Silver Ridge, carrying the scent of wildflowers through open windows, while the morning sun painted warm golden light across the front porch of Brooks' family restaurant. Less than a year after Emily first walked through its weathered door, the little restaurant had become the busiest gathering place in town. Long before noon, wagons lined the street outside, and neighbors often waited patiently with cheerful conversation until a table became available. Some customers came for the famous chicken and dumplings, others for Emily's fresh bread or fruit pies, but nearly everyone returned because the restaurant offered something that could not be written on a menu. It offered peace. Margaret Brooks had recovered far beyond what the town doctor had once believed possible. Though age had left her movements slow, she insisted on greeting every guest from her favorite rocking chair beside the front window. Her silver hair was once again neatly braided each morning, and healthy color had returned to her gentle face. Whenever newcomers complimented the restaurant, Margaret smiled with quiet gratitude. "I came back to life because of one bowl of chicken and dumplings," she would often say. "But I stayed because this kitchen reminded me that people can heal each other." Her words spread through Silver Ridge almost as quickly as Emily's cooking. Nathan hardly recognized himself anymore. The weary man who had once opened the restaurant only because he had no other choice now unlocked the front door each morning with genuine excitement. He and Emily worked together almost without speaking, each anticipating the other's next movement through months of shared routine. One reached for fresh herbs while the other prepared the broth. One served coffee while the other removed bread from the oven. Their quiet partnership had become the steady heartbeat of the restaurant. One evening after closing, the last dishes had been washed and the lamps burned softly across the empty dining room. Outside, spring rain tapped gently against the windows. Emily stood arranging fresh flowers on the counter while Nathan quietly replaced another log in the stove. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "When you first came here," he said softly, "I thought I was hiring someone to help save a restaurant." Emily looked toward him. "I didn't realize you were saving my family." His voice remained calm, but his eyes revealed years of gratitude that words had never managed to express. Emily smiled gently. "You gave me a chance when I had nowhere else to go." Nathan stepped closer. "I don't want to imagine this place without you anymore." He reached into his apron pocket and carefully placed a small wooden spoon on the counter. It had been carved by his late father decades earlier, polished smooth by years of cooking, and carefully preserved after his parents first opened the restaurant. "My father always believed this spoon should belong to the person who loved this kitchen most." Emily picked it up carefully, tracing the worn handle with her fingertips. "I'd like us to keep this kitchen together," Nathan continued quietly. "Not as employer and apprentice, as husband and wife." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears unlike those she had hidden outside Benjamin Foster's restaurant months before. Those had been born from rejection. These came from finally knowing she had found the place where she belonged. She answered with a simple nod. The wedding took place several weeks later, before the restaurant opened for the lunch service. There were no expensive decorations, no elaborate banquet, and no grand speeches. Friends from across Silver Ridge filled the dining room where countless ordinary meals had quietly changed extraordinary lives. Margaret stood proudly beside them, healthier than anyone had imagined possible, only months earlier. Even Benjamin Foster attended. When the ceremony ended, he walked to Emily, shook Nathan's hand, and smiled with sincere respect. "You chose wisely," he said, "both of you." Years passed, and Brooks' family restaurant became known far beyond Silver Ridge. Travelers crossed counties to taste the famous chicken and dumplings, yet many later admitted the food alone was not what stayed with them. Whenever young cooks asked Emily the secret behind the restaurant's success, she never spoke about recipes first. "People may walk through your door because of a meal," she would say, with a warm smile. "But they'll come back because you made them feel like they had finally come home." And so the little restaurant that had once struggled to survive became a place where strangers found comfort, families found one another again, and hope was served every day in a simple bowl of chicken and dumplings, prepared with kindness. As this story comes to an end, perhaps it leaves behind a quiet reminder that some of the greatest changes in life begin with the smallest acts of kindness. A warm meal, an open door, a second chance, or simply believing in someone when no one else does. These simple moments often become the memories people carry for a lifetime. In our own busy lives, we may never know how deeply one thoughtful gesture can touch another heart, just as we may never realize how much we ourselves need a place where we feel welcomed. If this story warmed your heart, please share it with someone who could use a little hope today. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What meal reminds you most of home, and who first made it for you? If you enjoy stories about kindness, second chances, and ordinary people changing lives in extraordinary ways, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next story. May God bless you and your family with good health, peaceful days, loving hearts, and a home always filled with warmth, hope, and people who truly care for one another. Thank you for spending this time with us, and until we meet again, may God watch over you always.